So, welcome to chapter 9 of writing the history of the First World War. Uh, and I'm just going to move on today to the third field, la troisième configuration, as they said in the French version of this book by Prost and Winter, which is cultural history. Now, you remember that we didn't have too much problem defining military history, but social history had been sufficiently ambiguous as an idea to form the basis of this history magazine, which has 7 different historians to say what it really is. Well, the third field, cultural history, is in some ways even more complex and not easy to define. Certainly involves a particular interest for the representation of the war and for how discourses about war are built up and for questions of identity. So these are 3 of the main features. They're not always all of them present, but these are priorities. Now, the rise of cultural history in the 70s, more in the 80s and since, has often been accompanied or run in parallel to the decline in the influence of materialist theories of history, or indeed of what is often called great narratives. Marxism in particular came under criticism because it was seen as a narrative that saw history moving forward more or less automatically from feudalism to capitalism, and then capitalism was collapsing and it would move on to socialism. That's how Marxism was seen. Now, there's lots of versions of Marxism, and so that would not necessarily refer to all of them, but it was certainly criticized in that way. And when the great number of countries in the Eastern Bloc who called themselves, who defined themselves as socialist and as based on Marxism, when they collapsed in an economic collapse in the 1980s and 1990s, then obviously that form of Marxism, in any case, lost a huge amount of influence. Now, as well as that, there has been a rise of certain theories of certain postmodernists, rarely historians as such, who have gone even further and claimed that it is impossible to find truth and to write truth about historical periods, and that all of our knowledge is simply different forms of discourse. And I'll see if I can remember to put on the blog what's the word? A book review, which I wrote about this very question. Now, the most hardline versions of this postmodernist theory seem to make the historian's job impossible, but more if other versions are taken, then the renewed accent on discourse and representation can be seen to have led to an enrichment of historical work. When Ilana Bettel wrote that book I mentioned to you on the conscripts, she does not only speak of their material situation, the material situation of the conscripted soldiers. She spends a lot of time on their mental representations of what military life and their own particular place in that is. She looks at the myths of heroism, and she looks at the idea, did the conscripts see themselves as soldiers or not? Now, cultural history has given rise to a large number of influential works on the First World War, such as the one by Paul Fussell, which explores the representations of conflicts in literary works. And more recently, in France, Nicolas Offenstadt wrote his book, 1418 aujourd'hui, which looks at all the representations of the First World War in France in the 21st century. So he goes through how it is shown in the theater, in rock music, in bande dessinée, in cinema, but also looks at those associations which organize the memory of the Great War. But before we go on to that, let's have a look at definitions. And if I go back to my good old Oxford Dictionary, like I got a nice definition of military history and of social history, I find that to my disappointment, no exact match is found for cultural history in British and World English. So there we are. Even the dictionary is not sure exactly what it is. Now, obviously, if it's going to be cultural history, that means we have to have some sort of idea of what culture is. We'll come to that in a moment. Yeah, so here is Fussel's work, which I just mentioned, The Great War in Modern Memory. And this one then often starts like Grande Guerre dans la France contemporaine. So what does the Great War mean for today? There are other books of cultural history around European culture and the Great War, for example. Now, there are different strands within cultural history. Sometimes, as I said, it's about the history of identity, of representation, of discourse. But also sometimes it can actually be about the period of the Great War and the cultural, the cultures of the time. And so this one here, the arts, entertainment and propaganda is obviously within that strand. Here is another one that came out recently. Again, I wrote a book review on this, National Myth and the First World War in Modern Popular Music. So this gentleman looked at popular music from I think the 60s until today, looking at folk, heavy metal, rap, and others. A large number of songs and pieces spoke about the First World War and used the First World War in different ways in different countries. So the use of the First World War in popular music was very different in Germany, for example, than it was in Britain or France. So a very interesting book, which goes through an awful lot of songs and representations. So notice here, we're not really talking about the history of the war. We're talking about the history of how the war has been used in discourses over the last 60 years. Now, Peter Grant has a particular objective in his book, which is to show that there are too many ridiculous pacifistic visions of the First World War in pop music, and not enough realistic, in his opinion, defenses of the positions of the new military historians who tend to defend the military hierarchy. Nevertheless, the book is very useful. So here we have more cultural history. The Secret Battle, Emotional Survival in the Great War. So here we're talking about the actual culture of 1914-18, not later representations, but nevertheless we're talking at something which is perhaps difficult to pin down. Yeah, emotional survival in the Great War, the history of emotional survival. So certainly one of the advantages of cultural history is it widens very much the object of historical study. Things which previously would be considered to be not really history are now considered to be history. And in fact, this is based, if I remember correctly, on the letters which soldiers wrote to their mothers. I know that in France recently there was a conference on brothers and sisters during the Great War. Based on letters and other documents to try to look at what did it mean to be a brother and sister at that time before the war, and how was that transformed by the war, which I thought was very interesting indeed. Here we have then fighting different wars, experience, memory, and the First World War in Britain. So experience, memory. So these are things which are of great interest to cultural history, and indeed commemoration, which is partly what Peter Grant was talking about in his book about songs. In some ways, commemoration is a major theme of cultural historians of the First World War. There are a very large number of books, some of them very good, about commemoration. Here you have then another similar thing, A War Imagined. Now, occasionally, some historians are a little unhappy because they say, oh, well, you know, the study of commemoration is not the study of the war period itself. It's a study of today, but this is not always the case. Sometimes the history of representation covers a particular period. So here we have Unionists and Great War commemoration in the north of Ireland, 1914 to 1939. So this is the Unionists, yes, those people, mostly Protestants, who want to maintain the union between Northern Ireland and Britain. And indeed, in 1914 of Ireland and Britain. So how did they use the Great War politically and culturally between 1914 and 1939? What kind of events did they organize? What kind of pictures did they circulate, and so on and so forth? And I think you can see there a stained glass window connected to the war. War, memory, and popular culture. This is similar ideas. This is a collection of essays. Yeah, when it says edited by, that means it's a collection of essays. So different ways that people have remembered the Great War, officially or collectively, because this is not about individual memory, it's about collective memory, not always national official memory, but collective memory. And look at that, essays on modes of remembrance and commemoration. And so there you have to look a little carefully at what is the difference of between remembrance and commemoration. Not necessarily easy questions to answer. I certainly don't have an immediate answer on that one. What's happened here? I got to the end of my file. Okay, that's not good. The politics of war, memory, and commemoration. Again, yes, similar things. That is to say, when we are remembering the First World War, does this have a political meaning? Does it have to be patriotic, I love the army? Or can there be many different ways of remembering the war? And after this chapter, the next chapters will be on commemoration deliberately and how commemoration has happened 100 years after the First World War. Here's an example then of commemoration, battlefield tourism. Now, the Great War battlefields in France mostly attract large numbers of tourists, almost none of them from France, almost all of them from Britain, America, Canada, and Australia, where it's not unusual to go to the battlefield, either because one had a family member, or just because it's a tradition. Indeed, the Prime Minister in 2014 said every school child will visit France to visit the battlefields of the First World War. Of course, this didn't happen, but that was his intention. So what are the advantages of cultural history? Well, first of all, it does have a wide view of culture. It's not just singing and dancing and painting. It's the way people represent the world to themselves. Cultural history, in particular about the First World War, has moved away from previous approaches to culture, such as the history of art or the history of ideas. Now, this has changed somewhat, and this is a slightly ungenerous definition of history of art, but sometimes history of art is, let us look at this person's paintings and see who he or she was influenced by and who they influenced. So very internal to a series of artworks. And this can be the same for documents with history of ideas. So cultural history is going much wider than that. Nevertheless, cultural history tries to concentrate on what is measurable and its influence, because, of course, one of the dangers of talking about culture in general is if you're a historian, you have to say things which can be demonstrated. You can't just give my impression of the time. This is what journalists do. It's their job. You know, my impression of the atmosphere in Britain today under the after Brexit and under the lockdown is this. I mean, it might be true, it might be false, but it's not easy to demonstrate. Whereas cultural historians do want to try to say that it's demonstrable. And so if they're going to claim that commemoration was particularly important to Protestants in Northern Ireland, they will do this by counting the number of meetings and counting the number of events and not just giving a general idea. Finally, cultural history allowed a certain compromise within universities, which allowed them to move away from materialist analysis or Marxist analysis, but maintain an interest in ordinary people. It was still history from below, which allowed a very wide approach to it. So strong points then, it's concentrated on lived experience and the widening of the historical objects. And the criticisms that have been made of cultural history are that it can simply look at the individual and what their representations are in their heads and ignore important institutions which form what is in our heads, whether it's the state, whether it's political organizations, whether it's religious organizations, and so on. So culture can lose explanatory power if it's simply talking about what people have in their heads without looking at why they have this in their heads. And secondly, it can, cultural history, if you're not careful, it can suggest a uniformity of culture, which does not in fact exist in a nation. That you cannot say the English view of the Great War in 1930, because there were several. So the questions that we might put about cultural history is the one I just mentioned. Is cultural history only concerned with what people have in their head? Where does people's culture come from? What is the influence of social class in the emergence of culture and cultures? And finally, which I just mentioned this already, what do social and cultural historians have in common? An interest in history from below. And Eric Hobsbawm, who is more known for doing social history, has had these two things to say about this. First of all, there's no question that our generation in the 50s and 60s, while they didn't completely neglect culture, did not actually give it sufficient weight in our analyses. I think this must be so. So he's accepting that, yes, the cultural historians have something new to bring. But he is a little worried because he says the main trouble about cultural turn is that an awful lot of it tends to move away, not merely from the social element in history, but also from the real history. For example, the enormous range of memory, of studies of memory of the 70s and the 80s, which are quite new, which didn't happen in our day in the 50s and 60s. Well, memory is about today. Memory isn't about what happened. It's about what people later on think happened. And finally, then a quotation from a defender of cultural history, Pascal Horry, who defines it in this way: l'histoire culturelle, méfiante a priori envers les interprétations unifiées. He's probably talking about Marxism, qui met en scène un homme simplifié et rationnel, et l'infatigable avocat d'un être humain traversé et parfois animé par des contradictions internes. So he is claiming, of course it may be, you may agree, you may not agree, that cultural history is better at talking about real people because it talks about how they represent the world to themselves and doesn't make the mistake of thinking that people are always being rational. So let's have a look at some new tendencies over the last 20 years, probably, or 10 years, in which are often linked to cultural history. And the first thing is that there has been changes in ways of communicating history. So here on the left, you have the First World War in 100 objects. That's 100 short chapters of 2 or 3 pages with an object on them. And perhaps you can see that this is a way that historians are trying to get the historical understanding out to more people, because it's easier to pick up a book called The First World War in 100 Objects, and you look at a couple, and then a few weeks later, you look at a couple more. It's an easier thing to give somebody as a present than a history book about the First World War of 500 pages that you're supposed to read in order. So certainly cultural history has come along with experimentation in ways of writing history. And on the right there, another one, Tracing Your Great War Ancestors, the Somme, a guide for family historians, where for a long time, there always has been a small number of family historians, but for a long time, academic historians were rather dismissive of them. Oh, well, they're just people wanting to know what their grandfather did. Who cares? That's less the case now, and especially with the internet, it's become much easier to trace your ancestors, and many families have 1 or 2 people who are really into that. And so you have books coming out on how to trace your great war ancestors, which include historical understanding about how things worked at the time and how documents can be analyzed and so on. The debates going on, so I'm leaving cultural history now and I'm going on to some more general recent So just a couple of books. I think this is just a couple of books I wanted to recommend. André Loy's Les Refus de Guerre, Une histoire des mutins, was an interesting new question. I'm always saying that the best historians are the ones who come up with new questions. Les Refus de Guerre, what he did is he looked at all the different ways that soldiers had to avoid fighting, even though there was a war on. And I think I may have already mentioned this, that of course you can refuse the war and go to prison instead, but that's a bit heavy. There were lots of ways that people managed to avoid war. And here you have The Deluge by Arthur Marwick, a more social history, and the very title is very much a committed position. The deluge refers to the biblical flood, and of course the deluge destroyed almost all humanity and almost all animals, except for the few that God had decided to save. Now, of course, he doesn't literally mean that, but if you talk about the First World War as the deluge, you mean everything changed. It completely transformed society. And this is an opinion, it's a theory, and worth debating, and certainly it made a big difference, but there is a big debate going on about how much changed and how much did not change during the First World War. There's also a debate going on in Britain between the revisionists and the others. The revisionists are people like Gary Sheffield, you see here, forgotten victory. So he's complaining that people have forgotten that Britain won the war. In general, the revisionists will defend the military hierarchy, say that they learned very quickly, and accuse other historians of being anachronistic and applying today's values to a war in the past, and so on and so forth. So this is fundamentally a conservative current. There's a conservative and a left-wing current within historiography in Britain and in France. In France, the debate has been done in a slightly different way. In France, for complicated reasons, a whole school of historians was built up around the Historien de la Péronne, including these two very interesting historians, and this was much less conservative than the revisionist historians in Britain, but nevertheless tended to put forward the idea of a culture de guerre, in which the most important thing about the war is that the French people accepted it and embraced it, and that they cannot be said to have been forced into war or pushed into war. Whereas the left wing would tend to emphasize more those elements of the capitalist system and of class society, which pushed soldiers into war and didn't leave much space for their own personal decision. And this leads me to one of the, I can't remember who asked this question, but one of the best questions I've ever seen asked about the First World War is, pourquoi les gens sont partis faire la guerre en 14? And one historian came back with the answer, parce qu'il y avait la guerre. Now, this is not as banal as it appears. What he's trying to say is that people were used to not deciding their lives. They didn't feel like they decided to go to war. There was a war on, and so they were in the army, or in Britain, they joined the army. That is to say that imagining that everybody is like a 21st century middle-class person deciding their life is quite a wrong way of looking at the world. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. And here is another one of the revisionists in Britain, but not quite so much. So it's got a bloody victory. So it's under such a victory. Nevertheless, look at the title, The Sacrifice on the Somme. Now, a sacrifice, it's not the same saying the sacrifice on the Somme and the massacre at the Somme. Because if you are a sacrifice, it's for a reason, for a noble reason. And this, of course, is a matter of opinion. Now, history has also been presented in other ways, and here we have a reality TV series, a historical reality TV series, Further Back in Time for Dinner, Series 1, Episode 2, the 1910s. So here what they've done is they've taken a modern family and obliged them to live for a few days in the style of the 1910s. And the idea is not so much to get them to understand, because they are generally chosen because they are telegenic, yes, but more to have millions of people watch a program about the First World War and social history and cultural history, instead of simply selling 300 books. And if you should want to know, it's not unusual to write a history book and sell 300 books to libraries, and that's it. Online these days, with the help of YouTube, there is a way of getting historical lectures out. I showed you one the other week. So one of the things that's happening to history is people are thinking of new ways of communicating it. And I wanted to now go on to some of the very recent history books on the First World War, which has been published. That is to say, so we've got these thousands and thousands of books, and new ones come out every year. But what I want to know is, do they ask new questions? Because if we have a book about Manchester in the First World War, and about Burnley in the First World War, and about Liverpool in the First World War, that's fine. If somebody then brings out a book about Leeds in the First World War, and Newcastle in the First World War, and Edinburgh in the First World War, we may consider as historians that we're not really going to learn anything very new, because these cities will be different, and the story will be more interesting for locals. But from a historical point of view, Manchester in the First World War and Newcastle in the First World War were probably pretty similar. So when we look, as historians, when we look at what's been published this year, we want to see if there are new questions being asked. Here's one then. British children's literature in the First World War. What books were children reading during the war, and how did they represent the war? So that's 2017. I hadn't seen this question before. We're happy when there's a new question. Words in the First World War, language, memory, and vocabulary. It's a linguist coming in then on something which would be considered cultural history. What were the words that were invented during the war? I haven't actually read this one, so I wouldn't like to be too precise about it, but they're trying to find new questions again. British trench names of the Western Front. The trenches went on for hundreds of miles, and there's not just one trench. You have the front trenches, and then the access trenches, and the supply trenches, and so on. So that everything can happen without putting your head up too high. And the soldiers invented names for the trenches. Now, sometimes these are, at Liverpool Street, just to remind them of home, and sometimes they are black humor, like Rats Alley. And things like that. And this gentleman thought it would be interesting to study in general what was this vernacular practice of naming trenches. Also in 2017, then, female Tommies, the frontline women of the First World War. Now, of course, the vast majority of soldiers of the First World War, and even members of the army in the First World War, were men, but more and more those jobs which could be done by women according to the ideology of the time, because they weren't going to have them fighting, were done by, and so a lot of the ambulance and clerical work and so on was being done by women. And so here is an attempt to look at what was their story, what was their experience, and what was it like living in a time when femininity was supposed to be something else, something much more fragile, and yet finding themselves in this situation. Baseball during the Great War. Okay, so the Great War was a time when the Americans arrived, they taught baseball to a lot of French, and it became popular for a while. That's part of this story. So new things being looked at. Law, magistrates in the Great War. We're still in 2017 here. Another new trend is global history. That is to say, to try to avoid giving the history of Britain or the history of France or the history of Italy, but to really look at the effects around the world. And so here you have 1916, a global history. The YMCA in the First World War, I spoke about its importance, providing cigarettes and writing paper, and providing support from the war by an openly Christian organization. So this was produced in 2016. So this is, if you want to write a history book on the First World War, you can be reassured they have not all been written. And again, notice that to write this history of the YMCA in the First World War, He wasn't getting his information from internet because there wouldn't be anything on there. He would be going to the headquarters of the YMCA and looking through the old papers they had. And this one, humor, entertainment, and popular culture during World War One. I have one chapter in there that came out in 2016. In 2018, slightly more polemical focus in on military history, 5 days from defeat, how Britain nearly lost the First World War. I think this is important because Germany lost the First World War, we always tend to think, oh, well, they lost because they were bound to lose. And this, of course, is not how history works at all. The songs and sounds of New Zealand's Great War, Goodbye Maoriland, I know this gentleman, Chris Bork. So popular songs from New Zealand and popular songs which the Maori used, and what specific emotional needs were being fulfilled by songs written in and for New Zealand. Of course, in New Zealand, well, of course, I inform you that in New Zealand, they often sold and sung the greatest hits coming over from England, but there was a local popular music culture as well. And a little series here from 2018, Dublin's Great Wars, internment during the First World War. Gay men during the First World War. Yes, you can see there, as we're expecting by now, the untold story of the gay men who served in 2 world wars. All right, okay, so this is a book about gay men in the First World War and the Second World War. This may well be because there's not that much documentation about the First World War. And very much a trend today, environmental history of the First World War. And in 2019, we have here is another attempt to get out to a wider audience, a trivia book. You can play Trivial Pursuits on the First World War. The definitive visual guide, pictures, and the first blitz. It says the first blitz in 100 objects. The first blitz, then the bombing campaigns in the First World War, far fewer than in the Second World War, but nevertheless something which is being studied here. And in 2021, this year, Passchendaele in 100 locations. It's almost a tourist guide. A Moonlight Massacre, Passchendaele again. Physical violence in East Central Europe from 1917 to 1923. So this is a cultural history looking at the idea of what happened to physical violence during this period. So it's quite innovative. British military memorabilia. Museums' history and the intimate experience of the Great War. Museums have wanted more and more to try to communicate the real lived experience of people from 100 years ago. Can this be done? Difficult question, but interesting question. And British women's histories of the First World War, representing, remembering, rewriting. Australian prisoners of war. So you can see there's still plenty of new things going on, although it has to be said that many, I've chosen a very small number, that I've chosen, say, 6 or 7 books from 2021. There are hundreds, but I've chosen the ones which are a bit new, which means that quite a lot of them are not really asking very new questions. And the last thing I want to mention is about what's happening in the universities, because history books can be written by university people. It's very common because we're paid, or they can be written by amateurs who are interested, or occasionally by professional writers, and it's rare. And so if you want to look at what is happening today, what are people studying today in Britain in the universities, one of the ways of doing it is looking at the subjects of the theses, the doctoral theses, the doctorates, which have been defended. And here I found 85 theses which have been defended in Britain since the year 2000. This is between 2000 and 2018. So 85 theses. That's quite a lot of doctoral theses. These are people spending 3 years writing about it. And so let's see what are the most popular subjects. Well, Military and diplomatic history, that first field we came up, was 18 out of the 85. So you can see that it's not dead. The revisionist historians often complain that we don't do enough military history anymore, but it's not dead. And indeed, some of these theses, not all of them by any means, but some of these theses are financed by the army. The army will have a small number of scholarships for people to study the First World War, which is very interesting. Now, the army, of course, is under the control of a democratic state, but in itself is often not very democratic. But from the point of view of history, what they will do is they certainly will not be telling their researchers what answers to give, but they will tend to give money to researchers who are asking the questions which interest them. So the priorities are there. Although you would be surprised, I know people who work for the army as researchers who are not militarist at all. So 14 military history and 4 diplomatic history. Social and political history, 28 of them, with 6 of them in political history, what governments do and so on. 12 general social history, 6 in medical history. That's a rising field, 6 in medical history. That's a lot of theses, in fact. I know it sounds like 6, but that's 6 300-page books. But nevertheless, by far the most popular is cultural history, including 4 theses in gender studies, 15 general, 6 in women's writing. This is often about novelists of the women novelists of the time. So that's a huge number to concentrate on one aspect of women's experience writing. 5 on the history of popular culture, and 11 on history and commemoration. So you can see that history and commemoration is an important field, an important stream, and that is a very good place to end this slightly longer chapter, because the next chapter will be actually about commemoration, because we're moving over now in this seminary from historiography to commemoration. What is the difference between history and commemoration? What is the difference between history and memory? Why do people commemorate? For what, in what contradictory ways and for what contradictory purposes did British people commemorate the First World War 100 years later? So watch this space, and that's all I have for now.